People think an inheritance is a blessing, a sudden windfall that wipes away the grime of poverty and the ache of a broken past. That is exactly what I thought when the envelope slid across the mahogany desk, handing my sister and me the deed to a property in the remote Appalachian peaks. But stone and steel do not offer sanctuary, they offer confinement. We thought our grandfather had built a fortress to protect us from the world that orphaned us. We were wrong. He didn't build that house inside the mountain to keep the world out. He built it to keep us in. The stench of boiled cabbage and industrial floor cleaner is something you never really wash out of your clothes. It clings to the fibers, a permanent olfactory reminder that you belong to the state. For 10 years, street. Jude's Home for Children in the bleak outskirts of Chicago was the only world my younger sister, Sarah, and I knew. We had been deposited there when I was 8 and she was barely 4, the collateral damage of a rain-slicked highway and a devastating head-on collision that took our parents. On my 18th birthday, the state's obligation to me expired. I sat in the cramped, windowless office of Mrs. Beatrice Gable, the facility director. She was a woman who had traded her empathy for bureaucratic efficiency decades ago. Across from her sat a man who fundamentally did not belong in this building. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than the orphanage's monthly food budget. His name was Gregory Davies, and his leather briefcase rested on his lap like a shield. "Happy birthday, Liam," Mrs. Gable said, though her tone suggested she was reading from a tax form. "As you know, today you age out of the system. You have your duffel bag?" "Yes, ma'am," I replied, my eyes fixed on the man in the suit. Sarah sat next to me, her hand gripping the fabric of my worn denim jacket. At 14, she wasn't aging out, but I had spent the last 2 years fighting a brutal legal battle for her custody. Emancipation, a steady job at a local mechanic's garage, and a painstakingly clean record had finally granted me guardianship. We were leaving together, or not at all. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Harper, my name is Gregory Davies. I am a senior partner at Davies, Hughes, and Croft. I represent the estate of Arthur Sterling." The name hit me like a physical blow. Arthur Sterling, our mother's father. The man who had completely disowned his daughter for marrying our father. A man he deemed unambitious and financially unstable. Arthur was a ghost, a phantom of wealth and old grudges who hadn't even attended our parents' funeral. When the state took us in, they contacted him. His secretary had politely informed social services that Mr. Sterling had no family. "Arthur Sterling died 6 months ago," Davies continued, his voice devoid of inflection. "He succumbed to a rather aggressive form of pancreatic cancer. As his sole surviving blood relatives, you and your sister are the primary beneficiaries of his estate." I felt Sarah stiffen beside me. "We don't want his money," I said, the words tasting like ash. "He left us to rot in this place. He let Sarah grow up wearing hand-me-downs from strangers." Davies offered a tight, sympathetic smile. "I understand your anger, Liam. Truly, I do. But Arthur was a complicated man, highly paranoid in his later years. And frankly, there isn't much liquid capital left. He liquidated almost all his assets 5 years ago." Mrs. Gable frowned, her bureaucratic mind offended. Liquidated? A man of his net worth? Where did it go? "Into a singular, highly specific architectural project," Davies said, opening his briefcase. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and slid it across the scratched wooden desk. "He left you a house. And before you dismiss it, Liam, I strongly advise you to take it. It comes with a trust that will cover property taxes and basic living expenses until Sarah turns 18. But the trust is conditional upon you residing at the property." I picked up the envelope. It was heavy. I broke the seal and tipped the contents onto the desk. A brass key, heavy and oddly shaped, clattered against the wood. Beside it fell a stack of Polaroids and a thick, folded deed. I picked up the first Polaroid. It showed a dense, aggressively green forest. Rising out of the trees was a sheer face of solid gray granite. Built directly into the stone was a massive, brutalist wall of reinforced concrete and a set of steel blast doors. It didn't look like a house. It looked like a military installation. "Where is this?" I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. "Oak Haven, North Carolina," Davies replied. "Deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Your grandfather purchased 400 acres of undeveloped mountainside. For the last 5 years of his life, he employed private contractors to hollow out a section of the mountain. The residence is subterranean, built into the rock." "Why?" Sarah whispered, speaking for the first time. Her blue eyes were wide, staring at the forbidding steel doors in the photograph. Mr. Sterling believed the world was becoming dangerously unstable, Davies said carefully. He built a sanctuary, a self-sustaining estate hidden from the world. He left specific instructions that the deed and the coordinates were to be handed to you on your 18th birthday, not a day sooner. I looked at the key. It wasn't a standard house key. It looked like it belonged to a bank vault. We had exactly $400 in my savings account. We had a rusted 1998 Ford Taurus parked outside. We had nowhere to go, no family, and a system that was ready to wash its hands of us. Arthur Sterling had abandoned us to a decade of institutional misery, only to hand us a concrete tomb in the mountains. But it was a tomb that came with a living stipend. It was a roof over Sarah's head that I didn't have to break my back to pay for. All right, I said, scooping the key and the deed back into the envelope. We'll take it. We packed everything we owned into 2 canvas duffel bags. It didn't take long. 10 years of life condensed into a few changes of clothes, some dog-eared paperbacks, and a framed photograph of our parents. The drive from Chicago to Oak Haven, North Carolina, took 2 exhausting days. The Ford Taurus rattled and shook whenever I pushed it past 60 on the interstate. The alignment's so bad my forearms ached from holding the wheel straight. But as we crossed into the Appalachian Mountains, the landscape shifted dramatically. The flat, gray sprawl of the Midwest was swallowed by towering peaks, dense blankets of emerald pine, and winding roads wrapped in a perpetual, clinging mist. Sarah spent most of the drive looking at the Polaroids Davies had given us. "Do you think he was crazy?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the tired engine. "Grandpa Arthur, I think you have to be at least a little crazy to carve a hole in a mountain and live inside it," I replied, keeping my eyes on the winding blacktop. "But crazy or not, it's ours now. We'll stay long enough to figure out how to sell it, or until I can find a decent job in town. We aren't staying in a bunker forever." Oak Haven wasn't so much a town as it was a collection of decaying buildings huddled together in a valley, trying to survive the dampness of the surrounding forest. There was a single gas station, a diner with a flickering neon sign, and a hardware store that looked like it hadn't seen a customer since the 90s. I pulled the Taurus up to the gas station to ask for directions, as the GPS on my phone had lost its signal an hour ago. The air outside was thick, smelling of wet earth and pine resin. An older man in a faded flannel shirt and suspenders was sitting on a rocking chair by the ice machine. He watched us get out of the car with undisguised suspicion. A tarnished badge was pinned to his chest. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a low gravel rasp. "Hope so," I said, approaching him with the printed coordinates from Davies. "I'm looking for a property up off County Road 9. Belongs to the Sterling estate." The old man stopped rocking. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, hardened instantly. He looked at me, then looked past me to Sarah, who was leaning against the car door. "You kin to Arthur Sterling?" he asked. "I'm his grandson, Liam Harper. This is my sister Sarah." The man stood up slowly. "I'm Deputy Thomas Reed. And if you've got any sense in your head, son, you'll turn that piece of junk car around and drive back to wherever it is you came from." "I have the deed," I said, my defensive instincts flaring. After years in the orphanage, I was used to authority figures telling me no. It's legally my property. Deputy Reed spat a dark stream of tobacco juice onto the asphalt. "Legal don't mean safe. Arthur Sterling came up here throwing money around, buying up Blackwood Ridge, brought in out-of-state crews, digging, blasting, swore up and down he was building a survival shelter." Reed took a step closer, lowering his voice. "But the men who worked on that place? The locals he hired to haul the dirt away? They didn't like what he was building. Said the blueprints didn't make no sense for a shelter. Said it felt like he was building a cage. A chill ran down my spine, but I stood my ground. We don't have anywhere else to go." Reed stared at me for a long moment, reading the desperation I was trying so hard to hide. Finally, he sighed, a sound like a deflating tire. "County Road 9. Follow it past the old logging mill. When the pavement turns to dirt, keep going for another 3 miles. You'll see a private road chained off to the left. That's your grandfather's driveway." "Thank you," I said, turning away. "Hey kid," Reed called out. I looked back. "You keep those blast doors locked. The wood's up on the ridge. They ain't right since he started digging." We followed Reed's directions in silence. The paved road surrendered to heavily rutted dirt, and the Taurus protested every inch of the incline. The trees grew thicker here, their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the late afternoon sun. It felt less like driving through a forest and more like descending into a tunnel. Finally, We reached the rusted chain blocking a gravel path. I got out, used bolt cutters I'd bought on the way down to snap the padlock, and drove us through. A mile later, the forest abruptly ended. We emerged into a cleared, rocky basin at the foot of a massive granite cliff. And there it was. The photographs hadn't captured the sheer scale of it. A vast slab of reinforced concrete, at least 40 feet high and 100 feet wide, was grafted directly into the face of the mountain. It looked like a brutalist dam holding back the stone. In the center of the concrete wall were two massive steel doors, rusted around the edges, flanked by heavy security cameras that tracked our movement with quiet, whirring motors. Power was clearly still running. Sarah stepped out of the car, her arms wrapped around herself despite the summer heat. Liam, it's a fortress. I grabbed the heavy brass key from my pocket and walked up to the pedestrian access door set into the right side of the main blast gates. There was a keypad, but the screen was dead. Below it was a heavy mechanical lock. I slid the key in. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clunk that echoed across the quiet basin. I grabbed the handle, planted my boots on the concrete, and pulled. With a screech of unoiled hinges, the heavy door swung outward. Cold, stale air rushed out to meet us, carrying the smell of ozone, dry dust, and something else, something sharp and metallic. I reached inside and found a heavy breaker switch on the wall. I threw it. Deep inside the mountain, a low, guttural hum began to vibrate through the soles of my shoes. Fluorescent lights flickered to life in a staggered sequence, illuminating a long, wide corridor lined with smooth, polished concrete. "Come on," I told Sarah, grabbing our bags. "Let's go meet our inheritance." If the outside was a brutalist nightmare, the inside was a schizophrenic clash of paranoia and extreme luxury. The main corridor led into a vast, cavernous living space that must have been blasted out of the heart of the granite. The vaulted ceiling was at least 30 feet high, supported by massive steel pillars, but the furnishings were straight out of a billionaire's penthouse. There were plush leather sectional sofas, antique Persian rugs laid over the polished stone floors, and a massive, state-of-the-art kitchen with stainless steel appliances. Fake windows lined one wall, glowing with artificial, simulated daylight to combat the claustrophobia of being underground. "Whoa," Sarah breathed, dropping her bag. She walked over to a massive bookshelf that spanned an entire wall, filled with thousands of hardcovers. He brought a whole library. "Look at this," I said, walking toward a heavy oak door at the back of the living area. I pushed it open. It was a control room. Banks of monitors, currently dark, lined the walls. A massive schematic of the facility was spread across a central drafting table. I looked over the blueprints. The estate was separated into 3 distinct levels. Level 1 was where we were living quarters, kitchen, library, and a massive pantry that the blueprints indicated was stocked with 5 years of freeze-dried food and water purification systems tied into a subterranean aquifer. But my eyes drifted down the schematic. Level 2 was labeled simply storage and generation. Level 3, the deepest point in the mountain, was heavily redacted on the blueprint. Black ink was crossed violently over whatever rooms were down there, with only one word visible: vault. "Liam, come look at this," Sarah called from the main room. I left the control room and found her standing by a beautiful mid-century writing desk. On top of it sat a leather-bound journal. Sarah had it open to the middle. "It's his handwriting," she said, stepping back so I could read it. I looked down at the frantic, slanted script of Arthur Sterling. October 14th. "The perimeter is secure. The cameras are running, but they know I'm here. I can feel them testing the edges of the property. Davies thinks I'm losing my mind. He thinks the embezzlement was just business. He doesn't understand the people I took it from. You don't steal $60 million from the Valerius Syndicate and get to live out your days in a Florida condo. They are hunting me. They killed my daughter. They killed her husband, staged it as a highway accident. I couldn't save her. But I can build a wall they can't breach." I stopped reading, the air suddenly freezing in my lungs. My parents' crash, the slick roads, the police report that said the brakes had failed. It wasn't an accident. Our grandfather hadn't just disowned our mother. His criminal actions had put a target on her back. He had stolen money from a cartel or a syndicate, and our parents had paid the price. And now, he had lured us here. "Liam," Sarah's voice trembled. "What does that mean about Mom and Dad?" "It means Arthur was a coward," I said, a hot, blinding rage building in my chest. "He stole from bad people, got our parents killed, and hid in a hole. But why give the house to us? She asked, tears welling in her eyes. If those people are still looking for him, looking for the money, why put us on the deed? I stared at the journal. Because Arthur is dead, and if the syndicate is still looking for their $60 million, he just gave them a giant neon sign pointing right at his only surviving heirs. I slammed the journal shut. We're leaving. Grab your bag, Sarah. We are not staying in this tomb. We'll drive to a motel, call Davies, and tell him to shove this deed. I grabbed my duffel bag and took Sarah's hand. We marched back down the polished concrete corridor, the artificial lights buzzing overhead. I reached the massive steel pedestrian door. I grabbed the handle and pushed. It didn't move. I frowned, planting my feet and shoving harder. The heavy steel wouldn't budge an inch. I looked down at the mechanical lock. The heavy deadbolts, 3 of them, thick as my wrists had slid into the doorframe. Where's the key? Sarah asked, panic rising in her throat. I reached into my pocket. It was there. I slid it into the lock and turned it. Nothing happened. The deadbolts remained firmly in place. I looked up at the wall. A small red light was blinking next to the door frame. Lockdown initiated. No, 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 I muttered, ripping at the handle. Open, you piece of junk! Suddenly, the lights in the corridor flickered. Not a power failure, but a dimming, as if a massive amount of electricity had just been diverted somewhere else in the facility. Then, we heard it. It didn't come from outside the door. It came from behind us, deep within the mountain. It was a heavy, mechanical, grinding sound, echoing up through the air vents. The unmistakable sound of gears turning, cables pulling taut, and heavy machinery groaning to life. Clank, whir, clank. Liam, Sarah whispered, backing away from the vents, her eyes wide with terror. What is that? I stood between her and the hallway leading back into the house. The sound was rhythmic, intentional. It was the sound of an industrial elevator, and it was coming up from level 3. The vault. We weren't locked in to keep the syndicate out. We were locked in with whatever Arthur had buried at the bottom of the mountain. The rhythmic, grinding hum of the industrial elevator vibrated through the polished concrete floor, traveling up my legs like a mild electric current. I didn't know what was in the vault, but I knew Arthur Sterling's paranoia had manifested it, and that meant it was dangerous. Liam, Sarah hissed, tugging frantically at the sleeve of my denim jacket. We have to hide. Now, she was right. Standing in front of the locked blast doors made us sitting ducks. I grabbed her hand and we sprinted away from the entrance, our boots slapping against the floor. We bolted past the mid-century writing desk and ducked behind the massive kitchen island, its thick quartz countertop offering the only substantial cover in the cavernous living area. I held my breath, pulling Sarah tight against my chest. The grinding sound grew louder, culminating in a heavy, metallic thud that shook the dust from the vaulted ceiling. The elevator had reached level 1. With a hiss of hydraulics, the heavy mesh doors slid open. I risked a glance around the edge of the quartz counter. I expected a monster, or perhaps a localized automated security drone. What stepped out was somehow worse. It was a man, but he looked like he had been living in a war zone. He wore tactical Kevlar body armor over a black combat uniform that was caked in dried mud and concrete dust. In his hands, he held a compact Heckler and Coke MP5 submachine gun, his finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. A tactical maglite was mounted to the barrel, its harsh white beam slicing through the dimness of the bunker. Another man stepped out behind him, similarly armed, holding a tablet with a cracked screen. Primary doors just engaged, the first man said. His voice was a harsh, gravelly whisper that echoed off the stone walls. The biometric trigger was tripped at the main gate. The system is active. You sure it's them, Dominic? The second man asked, tapping aggressively at his tablet. Dominic scoffed. Who else would it be, Bennett? Davies said he handed the kids the deed in Chicago 2 days ago. They're the only ones with the Sterling DNA required to wake this place up. Find them. A cold realization washed over me. Heavy and suffocating. Gregory Davies, the polished lawyer with his sympathetic smiles and expensive charcoal suit, wasn't just a reluctant executor of a crazy old man's will. He was working for the Valerius Syndicate. Arthur Sterling had stolen $60 million and locked it behind a system that only his bloodline could open. Davies hadn't given us an inheritance, he had delivered the key to his bosses. We were the key. Spread out? Dominic ordered. Check the library and the sleeping quarters. Davies said we need one of them alive for the level 3 scanner. Shoot to wound if you have to, but do not hit center mass. They stepped fully into the living area, their boots crunching on the antique Persian rugs. I looked around frantically. I was an 18-year-old mechanic. My fighting experience was limited to a few scraps behind the Street Jude's dumpsters. I had a pair of bolt cutters in my duffel bag by the front door, but that was 50 feet away. I looked up. Directly above the kitchen island was a heavy cast iron pot rack, suspended by two thick steel chains. I looked at Sarah and put a finger to my lips. She nodded, her face pale, tears streaking through the dirt on her cheeks. I reached up quietly and grabbed the heavy wooden handle of a massive cast iron skillet hanging from the edge of the rack. I slipped it off the hook. "I got movement by the control room," Bennett called out, sweeping his flashlight toward the heavy oak door we had investigated earlier. "Check it," Dominic replied, moving toward the library on the opposite side of the room. Bennett walked slowly toward the kitchen area, his gun raised. As he passed the edge of the quartz island, I didn't think. I just reacted. I lunged upward from behind the counter, swinging the heavy iron skillet with everything I had. It connected with the side of Bennett's head with a sickening crack. He didn't even have time to shout. His eyes rolled back, and he crumpled to the floor, his submachine gun clattering loudly against the stone. "Bennett!" Dominic shouted from across the room, whipping around. His flashlight beam caught me standing over his unconscious partner. "Run!" I screamed at Sarah. Gunfire erupted, the deafening crack, crack, crack of the MP5 shattering the silence. Bullets chewed into the quartz countertop, spraying us with sharp fragments of stone. I grabbed the submachine gun from Bennett's limp hands clumsily, my fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar weight, and shoved Sarah toward the heavy oak door of the control room. We threw ourselves inside just as another burst of gunfire splintered the oak frame. I slammed the heavy door shut, threw the 3 interior deadbolts, and dragged a heavy steel filing cabinet in front of it for good measure. Outside, Dominic slammed his shoulder against the wood. "Open the door, kid! You have no idea what you're dealing with!" I backed away, panting heavily, my hands slick with sweat on the cold metal of the gun. We were trapped. The control room was dead quiet, save for the frantic sound of our own breathing and the heavy thuds of Dominic kicking the oak door. "Liam." Sarah was hyperventilating, her back pressed against the far wall. "He's gonna get in." "No, he's not," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. The oak was thick, but it wouldn't hold up to sustained gunfire if Dominic decided to just shoot the locks out. I looked at the banks of dark monitors. "We need to see what we're working with. Help me find the power switch for these screens." I scrambled to the central drafting table where the blueprints were still laid out. Beneath the table was a heavy industrial surge protector. I flipped the main switch. Instantly, the control room hummed to life. 6 large monitors mounted on the wall flickered from black to a glowing, sterile blue before shifting to live camera feeds. Arthur's paranoia had one benefit. The man had wired the entire mountain with high-definition surveillance. On monitor 1, we saw Dominic pacing outside our door, talking furiously into a satellite radio. On monitor 2, the front pedestrian door was visible, firmly locked down with heavy steel deadbolts. Monitor 3 showed the elevator shaft. But it was monitor 4 that caught my attention. It was labeled level 2, sub-basement. The feed showed a massive, cavernous room filled with heavy Caterpillar diesel generators and water filtration tanks. But scattered across the floor of the generator room were sleeping bags, empty MRE wrappers, and military-grade equipment crates. "They've been here," I muttered, leaning closer to the screen. "Sarah, look at this. They didn't just arrive. They've been living down on level 2. How did they get in if the front door was locked?" she asked, wiping her eyes. I traced my finger over the main blueprint on the table. "They didn't come through the front door. Look here." I pointed to a ventilation shaft that ran from level 2, through the bedrock, and out to the surface. "They dug their way in through an exhaust vent weeks ago, but they got stuck. Arthur's internal security doors locked them on the lower levels. They couldn't get up to level 1, and they couldn't get down to level 3. Suddenly, audio crackled to life from the control board speakers. It was tied to the camera feeds. Dominic's voice filled the room, tense and angry. "Davies, things went south. The older kid has Bennett's weapon. They're locked in the primary control room." A cool, familiar voice responded through the radio static. It was Gregory Davies. "Dominic, you incompetent fool. I didn't spend 5 years tracking Arthur's shell companies and orchestrating this legal handover for you to get outsmarted by a teenage grease monkey. Do you have the blood? Not yet. But they're trapped." The Syndicate wants that 60 million, Dominic. The Valerius family is losing patience. Arthur locked the level 3 vault behind a biometric scanner calibrated to his specific genetic markers. That money is useless without the kids. Flush them out. Use the ventilation overrides if you have to. Gas them, smoke them out. I don't care. Just get me a pint of their blood and open that vault. I felt sick. A decade of suffering in a state-run facility, all while this lawyer manipulated our files, waiting for the exact legal moment he could force us to this mountain to act as human lockpicks. They're gonna use the vents, Sarah whispered, staring at the air conditioning grate above us. I looked down at the blueprints. If Dominic gained access to the HVAC controls in the main living area, he could pump carbon monoxide from the level 2 diesel generators directly into our room. We had minutes, at best. We can't stay here, I said, my mechanic's mind racing, analyzing the schematics like I would a busted engine block. But we can't go out the front door either. So where do we go? I placed my finger on the heavily redacted section of the blueprint. Level 3. The vault. Arthur built an escape route, I said, tracing a faint, almost invisible dotted line that bypassed the main elevator shaft. There's an emergency maintenance chute that drops from the control room straight down to level 3. If the biometric lock is down there, it means the secondary manual override for the blast doors has to be there too. You want to go down? Sarah asked, horrified. Toward the vault? What if there are more of them? Dominic and Bennett were trapped on level 2, I reasoned, grabbing the MP5 off the desk and checking the magazine. It was heavy, terrifyingly real. No one has been inside level 3 since Arthur died. It's the only place in this mountain that's safe. I walked to the back corner of the control room, following the blueprint schematic. There was a heavy metal grating bolted into the floor, hidden beneath a Persian rug. I kicked the rug aside and dropped to my knees, using a heavy screwdriver from the desk drawer to pry the grate loose. It lifted with a groan, revealing a dark, vertical steel tube with ladder rungs welded to the side. A blast of cold, stale air hit my face. Hiss. A thick, gray smoke began pouring through the air vent above us. Dominic had figured out the HVAC system. He was trying to smoke us out. Sarah, go! I coughed, pushing her toward the open grate. Climb down. Don't look down. Just hold on to the rungs. She didn't hesitate. She swung her legs into the dark chute and began to descend. I grabbed the flashlight, slung the submachine gun over my shoulder, and followed her into the dark. As I pulled the heavy metal grate shut above me, plunging us into total darkness, I realized our grandfather hadn't just left us a house. He had left us a war, and if we wanted to survive it, we were going to have to claim the inheritance he buried in the dark. The air inside the maintenance chute was stagnant and tasted of oxidized metal. The darkness was absolute, pressing against my eyes until I finally managed to click on the tactical maglite I had stripped from Bennett's submachine gun. The harsh white beam illuminated a rusted steel ladder plunging straight down into the bedrock. Don't look down. Sarah, I echoed my earlier command, my voice swallowed instantly by the narrow acoustic confines of the tube. Just focus on my shoulders. One rung at a time. My arms burned. The MP5 slung across my back repeatedly clanged against the steel walls, a jarring, metallic ringing that I prayed wouldn't be heard over the hum of the diesel generators on level 2. The smoke from the HVAC system was creeping down the shaft above us, a gray, toxic fog that tasted like burning plastic. We climbed for what felt like an eternity, descending through the very heart of the Appalachian granite. Finally, my boots hit solid ground. I stepped back, aiming the flashlight upward so Sarah could see the last few rungs. She dropped beside me, her chest heaving, her hands blistered from the rough steel. We were standing in a narrow access corridor, the walls paneled in pristine, brushed aluminum. It was a stark contrast to the brutalist concrete of the upper levels. This wasn't a bunker, it looked like the airlock of a submarine. At the end of the hall stood a single, massive door. It wasn't concrete or standard steel. It was a circular, polished titanium vault door manufactured by the Mosler Safe Company, complete with heavy locking bolts thick as a man's thigh. Next to the door was an illuminated pedestal console. A glass biometric scanner glowed with a soft, pulsing green light. Is that it? Sarah whispered, shivering in the subterranean chill. The vault? Yeah, I muttered, approaching the console. I slung the MP5 off my shoulder and laid it on the floor. I examined the screen above the handprint scanner. It displayed a single line of text, awaiting Sterling genetic marker. I hesitated. Davies had said the syndicate needed our blood to open the vault and retrieve the $60 million. If I placed my hand on that glass, I would be handing the Valerius Syndicate exactly what they wanted. But we were trapped. The only way out was back up the chute straight into Dominic's crosshairs. As I studied the console, my eyes caught a small, secondary screen tucked beneath the lip of the pedestal. It was dark, but a faint red light blinked next to a USB port. My mechanic's intuition kicked in. This wasn't just a lock, it was a localized intranet terminal. I pressed my thumb against the power button on the secondary screen. It flickered to life, requiring a numeric passcode. "Sarah, what was Mom's birthday?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "October 14th, she said instantly. "Why?" I punched in 1014. The screen flashed green. A pre-recorded video file appeared on the desktop, labeled simply "for the heirs." I tapped the screen. The video buffered, then dissolved into the face of a man I hadn't seen in over a decade. Arthur Sterling. He looked skeletal, the pancreatic cancer already hollowed out his cheeks, his eyes burning with a manic, feverish intensity. He was sitting at the mid-century desk on level 1. If you are watching this, Liam or Sarah, it means two things. Arthur's raspy voice filled the quiet corridor. First, it means I am dead. Second, it means you found the house and the Valerius family found you. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my jacket. "I didn't bring you here to make you rich," Arthur continued, his digitized eyes staring straight through the camera. "The $60 million Davies is looking for? It's not in the vault. I burned that money years ago trying to buy off the people who killed your mother. It didn't work. You can't buy off a syndicate. You can only eradicate them." I felt the blood drain from my face. "There's no money." "Inside this vault is a localized server rack," Arthur's recording explained, coughing violently into a handkerchief before continuing. "It contains the Valerius family's entire digital infrastructure, their ledgers, their offshore accounts, the blackmail files they hold on every politician in the eastern seaboard. I stole their leverage. And the vault itself? It's laced with 300 pounds of military-grade thermite wired directly into the biometric scanner." My eyes darted to the glowing green handprint reader. "Davies will force you down here. He will make you use your handprint to open the door. He thinks the biometric lock disengages the vault. It doesn't. Your handprint is the detonator. Once you touch that glass, the vault doors will seal, the thermite will ignite, and everything inside, including whoever is standing in the primary elevator shaft, will be incinerated at 4,000 degrees. Arthur leaned closer to the camera, a tear tracking down his gaunt face. "I am so sorry I couldn't protect your mother. I am sorry I left you to the state. But I built this mountain to be a tomb for the monsters who destroyed our family. Use the scanner. Burn them." Behind the console is a secondary ventilation shaft that leads to the eastern ridge. Walk away and never look back. The screen went black. Before I could even process the magnitude of my grandfather's insane, vengeful architecture, the heavy metal grating at the top of the maintenance chute echoed with a massive, booming crash. "They found the chute." Sarah panicked. A voice echoed down the long vertical pipe. It was Davies. "Liam! I know you're down there." The lawyer's voice was distorted by the metal acoustics, stripped of all its previous faux warmth. "Dominic is dropping a stun grenade down that shaft in exactly 30 seconds. Climb up, or we will drag your unconscious bodies up here and extract the blood from your veins with a syringe." I looked at the glowing green scanner. It wasn't a lock. It was a trigger. "They aren't coming down," I realized, grabbing the MP5. "They're going to try and force us up." "What do we do?" Sarah asked, trembling violently. "We give them exactly what they came for," I said, a cold, terrifying calm washing over me. I crouched behind the heavy steel base of the biometric pedestal, pulling Sarah down beside me. The massive, circular titanium bulkhead of the Mosler Vault loomed at our backs, an impenetrable wall of brushed metal locking away the digital sins of the Valerius Syndicate. I kept the barrel of the MP5 trained dead center down the pristine aluminum access corridor, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. But my hands were shockingly steady. "Davies!" I screamed, my voice tearing through the absolute stillness of the subterranean air, bouncing off the metal walls with a harsh, metallic resonance. "Hold the grenade! We're coming out!" For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the ragged, terrified breathing of my sister huddled against my knee. Then, the mountain answered. A deep, violent shudder vibrated up through the soles of my boots. It wasn't the sound of a man climbing down a metal ladder, it was the heavy, rhythmic, industrial groan of steel cables under massive tension. The primary elevator was descending. Davies hadn't bothered with the claustrophobic maintenance chute. He had used the control room to override the security protocols and summon the freight elevator directly to level 3. The gears ground to a screeching, sparking halt at the far end of the corridor. With a sharp hiss of pneumatic pressure, the heavy mesh gate slid open. Gregory Davies stepped out into the harsh fluorescent light of the access hall. He looked entirely alien in this brutalist underworld. His charcoal suit was still immaculately pressed, though his silk tie had been loosened and a thin sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He carried no weapon, treating this subterranean standoff with the exact same detached arrogance he had displayed in Missis. Gable's cramped orphanage office in Chicago. Behind him, massive and lethal, stood Dominic. The mercenary looked battered. A swollen, purple bruise covered the left side of his face where I had struck his partner with the cast iron skillet, and a trickle of dried blood crusted his jawline. His eyes were cold, dead things, and the laser sight of his compact submachine gun cut a sharp red line through the dusty air, sweeping the corridor before settling squarely on my chest. "A valiant effort," Liam Davies said smoothly, his voice echoing off the aluminum paneling. His dress shoes clicked rhythmically against the floor as he took 2 steps forward, stopping a safe distance away. "Truly, Arthur would be proud of your ingenuity. You've managed to inconvenience highly trained professionals for the better part of an hour. But you are an 18-year-old mechanic from a state-run facility, not a soldier. This ends now. Stay back," I warned, adjusting my grip on the MP5. "I know what's in the vault, Davies. I know there's no money." Davies sighed, a long, exaggerated sound of corporate fatigue. He reached up and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, looking at me with something resembling pity. "Arthur was a paranoid old fool. Liam. He stole $60 million in unmarked bearer bonds and digital assets. It has to be in there. The syndicate tracked his financial footprint directly to this mountain. There is nowhere else it could be. He burned it." I spat, my voice echoing loudly. "He spent it all trying to buy protection, trying to build this concrete coffin to hide from you people. Lies of a desperate man recorded on a server." Davies countered smoothly. "Arthur was a master of misdirection. But let us say, for the sake of argument, that you are right. Let us say the vault only contains the Valerius family's digital infrastructure, their ledgers, their blackmail files, their offshore routing numbers. Do you honestly believe they will let you live if you keep it sealed? That data is worth 10 times the cash he stole. Put the gun down, Liam. Let us handle this like civilized men." I gripped the weapon tighter. "Civilized? You orchestrated the murder of my parents. You ran them off a slick highway and called it a tragic accident." Davies' face hardened, the faux sympathy vanishing instantly. "Your father, Thomas, was collateral damage. The brakes on that Ford were cut by a low-level enforcer named Russo. It was sloppy work, meant only for your mother to send Arthur a message. But Thomas decided to drive that night. It wasn't personal, Liam. It was simply the cost of your grandfather's hubris. Now, place your hand on the scanner, open the vault, and I give you my solemn word, as an officer of the court, that you and your sister can walk out of this mountain." "Your word is worth nothing," I said, my blood running cold at the casual way he dismissed my parents' lives as a sloppy accounting error. Davies snapped his fingers. Dominic didn't hesitate. He shifted his aim. The bright red dot of the laser sight moved off my chest and tracked downward, settling directly onto the center of Sarah's forehead. She let out a choked, muffled sob, pressing her face into my jacket. The scanner, "Liam, Davies," ordered, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "Or Dominic will put a 3-round burst through your little sister's skull, and I will physically drag your bleeding hand onto that glass plate myself. You have 3 seconds. 1, Dominic grunted, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Okay!" I yelled, my voice cracking. I threw my hands up. "Okay, you win." I let the MP5 slip from my fingers. It hit the aluminum floor with a heavy, metallic clatter that sounded like a death knell in the quiet corridor. I slowly stood up from behind the pedestal, raising my hands to shoulder height. "Good boy," Davies sneered, the smug, corporate arrogance returning to his face. "Step up to the console. Press your hand flat against the glass. Keep it there until the biometric array flashes blue, indicating a successful DNA sequencing. I turned my back to them, facing the glowing green glass of the biometric scanner. The screen above it still read, "Awaiting Sterling Genetic Marker." I looked down at Sarah. She was looking up at me, her blue eyes wide with absolute, paralyzing terror. But beneath the fear, I saw the exact same stubborn resilience that had kept us alive in Street, Jude's for 10 years. I gave her a microscopic nod, subtly shifting my foot toward the dark recess behind the console where Arthur had promised the hidden escape tunnel lay. I took a deep breath, inhaling the stale, metallic air of the bunker one last time. I raised my right hand, hovering it inches above the cool glass. "Do it, kid," Dominic barked from the end of the hall. I slammed my palm down onto the scanner. The glass didn't flash blue. It instantly flared from a soft, pulsing green to a blinding, violent crimson red. A mechanized female voice.com, synthetic and utterly devoid of emotion, echoed from hidden speakers recessed into the aluminum ceiling. Sterling biometric confirmed. Primary locks disengaged. Protocol scorched earth initiated. Davies frowned, taking a hesitant step backward, his polished shoes scuffing the floor. "What did you do? Why is it red? What does scorched earth mean?" "It means he didn't leave you the money, Davies," I said, grabbing Sarah's hand and hurling us both backward, diving behind the thick, blast-resistant steel base of the console. "He left you a coffin. Vault ceiling. Containment protocols active," the automated voice droned. High above us, deep within the bedrock ceiling of the corridor, pneumatic locks violently disengaged. A massive slab of solid, reinforced steel, at least 2 feet thick and weighing several tons, dropped from the ceiling halfway down the hallway. It slammed into the floor with a concussive, earth-shattering boom that knocked the breath completely from my lungs. The impact kicked up a massive cloud of concrete dust and instantly severed the hallway in two. Davies and Dominic were trapped on the side with the elevator. Sarah and I were sealed in the 10-foot alcove with the Mosler vault. Muffled, frantic shouts erupted from the other side of the steel barricade. I could hear the panicked thud of Davies pounding his fists against the metal. A second later, the deafening roar of Dominic firing his submachine gun on full auto echoed through the barrier, the armor-piercing bullets ricocheting uselessly against the impenetrable drop door. Thermite ignition in 3, 2, 1. A sound like a commercial jet engine roaring to life on a runway vibrated through the floorboards. The noise was physical, rattling the teeth in my skull. The massive titanium vault door behind us began to change. First, the silver metal took on a dull, angry orange hue. Then, within seconds, it shifted to a blinding, searing white. The heat radiating off the metal was instantaneous and suffocating. The air in our tiny sealed alcove instantly superheated, singeing the hair on my arms and turning the sweat on my forehead to steam. 300 pounds of military-grade thermite, packed securely around the Syndicate's servers, had ignited. It was a chemical fire that didn't need oxygen to burn, rapidly reaching temperatures exceeding 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It was hot enough to melt an engine block into slag. The thick layers of titanium paint on the vault door began to bubble and peel away in sheets of black ash. "Liam, we're gonna burn!" Sarah screamed, shielding her face with her arms from the blinding, radioactive light of the melting vault door. The heat was becoming unbearable, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. "The tunnel!" I shouted over the deafening roar of the chemical fire. I scrambled to the back wall of the alcove, feeling blindly along the rough granite where the polished aluminum paneling ended. My blistered fingers caught the edge of a heavy, rusted iron latch set deep into the rock. It was exactly where Arthur said it would be. I grabbed it with both hands, planted my boots against the stone, and threw my entire body weight backward. With a harsh grind of metal against rock, the heavy iron door swung outward. A miraculous, saving rush of freezing, fresh mountain air hit my face. It smelled of wet pine needles, damp earth, and decaying leaves, the most beautiful, intoxicating smell I had ever experienced. It wasn't a man-made corridor. It was a natural, jagged limestone cave fissure that Arthur's engineers had stabilized with heavy steel support beams, leaving a narrow, winding path that cut straight upward through the mountain's flank. "Go! Go!" I shoved Sarah into the dark, jagged opening just as the center of the Mosler vault door began to slump and liquefy, the molten titanium dripping onto the floor like glowing, white-hot wax. We threw ourselves into the absolute darkness of the tunnel. I pulled the heavy iron door shut behind us, cutting off the blinding light, though the terrifying roar of the thermite fire still vibrated through the limestone walls. We didn't look back. We climbed. The fissure was incredibly steep and terrifyingly narrow. We scrambled upward on our hands and knees, tearing our jeans on jagged rocks, our fingers slipping on patches of wet moss. I used the small tactical flashlight I had kept in my pocket, its beam cutting erratically through the dark as we crawled higher and higher into the earth. The air grew thinner, colder, but with every foot we climbed, the oppressive, suffocating heat of the thermite fire faded further behind us. My muscles screamed in protest, my lungs burned from the exertion and the residual concrete dust. We climbed for what felt like hours, moving entirely on adrenaline and the raw, desperate biological imperative to survive. Finally, the beam of my flashlight caught something ahead that wasn't gray rock. It was a tangle of thick tree roots. I pushed past them, hitting a wooden barrier covered in dirt and dead leaves. I kicked at it violently. Once. Twice. On the third kick, the rotted wood splintered and gave way. We burst out of the mountainside, tumbling headfirst onto a soft, wet bed of pine needles. We had emerged on the eastern ridge of Blackwood Mountain. The night air was freezing, biting through our sweat-soaked clothes, but we drank it in greedy, gasping lungfuls. We were miles away from the main concrete bunker entrance, miles away from the access road, and miles away from Gregory Davies and the molten tomb he was currently trapped inside. I collapsed onto my back, staring up at the vast, uncaring canopy of Appalachian stars. My chest heaved violently. Sarah lay next to me, her face covered in dirt, soot, and tears. But she was alive. We were alive. Far below us, muffled by thousands of tons of solid granite, a deep, subterranean explosion sent a violent tremor through the earth. The ground beneath our backs vibrated, shaking the pine needles from the trees. And then there was only the sound of the mountain wind whistling through the branches. The mountain had swallowed the fire, keeping Arthur Sterling's final, violent secret buried deep within the stone forever. People think an inheritance is a blessing. We learned the hard way that it can be a curse, a delayed consequence of sins you never committed. The house inside the mountain wasn't a sanctuary. It was a carefully constructed weapon, and we were simply the trigger our grandfather needed to pull from beyond the grave. We never went back to Oak Haven, and we certainly never claimed the property taxes. Whatever remained of the Valeria Syndicate's empire burned at 4,000 degrees in the belly of that granite peak, along with the men who chased us. We walked away with nothing but the clothes on our backs and the lives we had fought so desperately to keep. But as Sarah and I stood on that ridge, breathing the cold, free air of the Blue Ridge Mountains, I realized Arthur had left us something valuable after all. He left us a blank slate,